This is a response to a guy on the internet under the name of the Atheist Voice. He voices opinion on the Bible and how Christians say that the gospel was written 2,000 years ago. And what he first says is that the gospel couldn't have been written 2,000 years ago, because if that's the case, literally it would have been written while Jesus was still alive. I think he's kind of splitting hairs here. He's basically, most Christians, myself included, would be using that in a generalized statement. Obviously, we're not saying that it was written exactly at, AD 15. Well, no, because Jesus was still alive. However, we know with certainty that the originals were written not much after Jesus' death, which I'll go into in a little bit. So what he says, of course, he says, he says that you think people were writing accurately history at that particular time. Well, yeah, the New Testament was written was writing accurate history at that time. If you look at a lot of archaeologists, whether they're Jewish or whatnot, who aren't even Christians, what's the first source they look at when they use their archaeology? It's the Bible. It's well known. Some of the greatest archaeologists out there, they'll have the Bible in one hand and their shovel in the other hand, because they know that they have certain faith that the Bible is accurate and true, because it's shown to be accurate historically wise through archaeology, as far as places and times and rulers and kings. More and more each day, archaeology is being unearthed that proves more and more the accuracy of Scripture. So to sit there and suggest that, well, no, history wasn't even accurate, they weren't writing history accurately at that particular time, is disproven by archaeology itself, and by the fact that many secular non-Christian archaeologists are using the Bible as their point of reference. He then goes into the saying that the Bible is transmitted as just like a phone book, the telephone phone book game. I've gone through this in another video, so you can check it out. Basically, what I can say to that is that the first century learning, just as it is today in the Middle Eastern world, is vastly different than the Western world as far as comprehending things. We learn to read and write. They learn to heighten their skills of listening orally and speaking orally. So there's no comparison there at all. The phone book game is meant to be a joke. It's meant to be funny. It's meant to be the first person speaks something, and the last person speaks something totally different. And studies have shown, there was one missionary that went to Baghdad, and he tested this game on children there, and they all got the game perfectly right. Every time they recited exactly what was spoken of first, and they, in fact, didn't understand the point of the game. So it's a totally different situation. Like I said, check out the video that I had about that. Then he says that, well, the Bible was written 50 years after Jesus. That's a lot of time for history to be rewritten. Well, I would suggest that no, that's not the case. First of all, we look at just history now. Let's look at, say, World War II. We know with quite a bit of accuracy what happened in World War II, who attacked who, what was being said, all these things that were going on. In the first century, well, say what is presupposed here is that the earliest writings were done in the 50s. Well, that's certainly not the case. If we know that, for instance, Acts was written by Luke, and Acts was written as an account of what was going on, we can understand that the account that was written quite early. In fact, probably earlier than what is expected, because a lot of the three main authors, the three main characters in Acts, Peter, James, and Paul, none of it mentions their death. In fact, at the end of Acts, Paul is still alive. And we know through history, we pieced together that Paul died most likely in 64 or 67 AD. And another presupposition is that, well, since our earliest manuscript is P52, which I believe conservatively can be dated around 90 AD. That was the fragment of the Gospel of John, 7 verses, I believe. That's a copy. That's not even the original. So most people would agree an original was written before the copy. So if you piece together all the things that are going on, for example, major events like in the Bible, Jesus mentions about the temple being destroyed, in reference as well to the temple of the Jerusalem temple. Well, that doesn't happen until 70 AD. Well, if that had happened before Mark wrote the gospel, because everybody believes Mark was the first gospel, then certainly he would have mentioned it, and any other gospels would have mentioned it too. But the fact remains, it wasn't mentioned. In fact, when Jesus mentioned it being destroyed, he never did mention anything about fire. Certainly, Mark would have put that in there as an emphasis to what was being said, to prove Jesus was fulfilling that prophecy in that sense. But he couldn't do it because it hadn't happened yet. So this shows us certain events will kind of put it into view in what time period we're talking about. So if that's the case, then the Gospels must have been written before AD 70, probably around 50s. A lot of people place Mark around 50 AD. Well, that's only 15, not even 20 years after Jesus had left the earth. So I think it's kind of naive to say, well, just because we have our earliest manuscript dates AD 90, that all the Gospels were written then. Well, that was just a copy of the original, or could have been a copy of a copy, in a sense. Then he uses the liking of the JFK assassination, and how minus all the videotapes, minus the Walter Cronkites and all the media attention that it was given, that we how we can see what had happened in that particular time. It's nothing like the first century. Well, I've already stated earlier that the way they transmit things is totally different than the way we do it now. And orally they transmitted things quite accurately. Plus, you had a lot of eyewitnesses that would have still been alive when these things were transmitted, and certainly you would have had people speaking out against it. And certainly that's not the case. We don't see any alterations in beliefs, especially through the Gospels. Nothing contradicts itself as far as beliefs are concerned. He then suggests that the earliest copies are within the middle of the 2nd century. Well, that is false, because as I mentioned, P52 is dated AD 90. That's conservative dating. Even if it was dated a little bit later, that doesn't disprove anything in a sense. But what is interesting is that there is some new finds. They've found quite a few, a handful of manuscripts dated early in the 2nd century, and one that they are quite sure is dated in the 1st century. Those, of course, are being examined by some of the top paleontologists in the world right now. So that hopefully will be issued soon, but I don't think that's going to matter to this particular guy who's writing this video. It doesn't matter if it was if they found one that was 10 years after Jesus. If you don't believe it, you're not going to believe it no matter what, in that regard. So he also mentions that the earliest full transcript or manuscript that we have is dated in the 4th century. While that is true, the full manuscript is given, that doesn't presuppose that we can't piece together things throughout the 2nd century, whatnot, in the 3rd century to have a full manuscript. It's just like me saying, well, I have 10 pages of a manuscript here that I'm going to have, 10 days from now, but right now I have 10 pages all kind of unassorted, but they're all there, but I'm going to piece it together into one manuscript. Obviously, if I read those single sheets of 10 sheets, it's going to be the same as it is with the one that's the full manuscript that's put together and stapled together or whatever. We can also look at the fact that all these manuscripts that are shown, these early manuscripts, do not conflict in any way what we see in our Bibles as far as the Orthodox beliefs in the gospel and whatnot. In fact, we don't even have to go specifically to those manuscripts. We could look in Scripture itself. We know that Paul was reciting prayers and hymns and whatnot that many historians believe are very early, and he was transmitting certain beliefs that were Orthodox beliefs very early. They had already had a structured theology, is what I'm trying to say. So we can look at that, and we can also look at the early fathers too, and the testimonies they have, because they used thousands and thousands of references to the Scripture. So even if we didn't have any of these manuscripts, we could piece together the Bible just from the early church fathers' writings of their homilies and sermons and whatever that they did for that era. So he says, you mean to tell me that these early authors got it right every single time? Well, nobody's suggesting that little details aren't perfect in each account of the Gospels. Obviously, we see variations of certain things, but it doesn't take away from the principle and the core of the Gospel in a sense. There are details that can be argued out and aired out for that matter, but nothing would take away from the core theology of Christianity in that sense. What is remarkable, though, is that as far as our manuscripts are concerned, there's over, I believe, 5,800 manuscripts now that we have, I believe, in the Greek, and that's overwhelming in the Greco-Roman era, as opposed to other authors like Aristotle, Philo, Plutarch, all those guys. Yet remarkably, even though there's a lot of variances, these are minor details like spelling errors and nuances, and like instead of saying an apple, it says a apple, things like that. There was recounted apparently about 400,000 different discrepancies in the New Testament with the manuscripts that were given. This is way back now. I think there was a guy named Mill that did that. This is back a couple of hundred years. But he, of the variants that he found, they were saying that historians are saying that, and New Testament scholars, is that only less than 1% of it is of any significance as far as a variant is concerned. Most of them are spelling errors and whatnot. Of course, people like Bart Ehrman and Athiest will not mention that point. They'll just mention these many errors. But what we have to understand too is that the reason why there's so many variants and spelling errors and whatnot is because we have a, a vast array of manuscripts to deal with. That's why there's so many errors. I mean, if we only had 10 manuscripts to deal with, we're not going to have that many errors. But the fact that we have 5,800 manuscripts plus all the copies in other languages, Syriac and